This story comes from my time as a resident assistant RA about 3 years ago at a large university in the southeastern U.S. Contrary to popular belief, RAs are not hired to be professional buzzkills. We are actually there to promote a safe living environment and encourage the personal growth of our residents. Pretty corny, yes, I am aware. This particular story is about a time when one of my residents was in a very unsafe situation and I happened to be there to help out. My first year as an RA, I lived on the 12th floor of our dorm, and the dorm housed over 500 freshman guys. Our university always gives a 3 or 4 day weekend between the end of classes and the beginning of finals, and this experience happened during that break right before spring finals in May, after which most people go home for the summer. A vast majority of the homesick freshmen in my building had also headed home for the long weekend. It was quiet. I spent my entire Saturday locked in a room studying. Literally 12 hours with barely a lunch break, and I was brain dead when I emerged at about 9 p.m. I intended to get some quick food and immediately go to bed, but I ran into some friends who convinced me that I needed to blow off steam after my study marathon, so I went to their apartment and we watched movies and played video games until about 2 a.m. I was completely out of it by that point. I stumbled back to my building, brain-dead and sleep-deprived. I passed the front desk and said a polite hello to the overnight desk attendant, who I knew well, and headed for the bed. As soon as I had stripped down and cuddled into bed for well-deserved sleep, my phone rang. It was my friend, Gary, calling from the front desk. I dumbly answered. "McAllister's sweet tea. Some girl just cussed me out and ran into the elevators and disappeared. She was yelling and screaming and just seemed messed up. Can you go check it out? Guys only dorm, girls only allowed when escorted by a guy. Safety reasons. Gary, I am not on call tonight, it has been a long day. I know, I just figured you'd still be awake since I just saw you. I didn't want to wake anyone else up. Fine, what floor did she go to?" I get out of bed, throw on some sweats and head down to the 10th floor, fully expecting this girl's boyfriend to have already let her into his room and leaving me with nothing to find or do. "Thanks, Gary." I get to the 10th floor and check the first hallway. No one is there. Just as I expected. I walk over to the second hallway, but a lady is actually there, standing in the hallway. Her arms are hanging down at her sides and her head is hung down and tilted to one side. It was like she was staring at where the wall and the floor meet, just beside her left foot, if that makes sense. Not a natural resting position. I walk up to her and stand about 15 feet away from her right side. She was looking down to the left and politely say something along the lines of, "Excuse me, ma'am, but you can't be here without an escort who lives in the building. I'm going to have to ask you to come back downstairs with me, please." No response. She stands completely still with her head still tilted. "Ma'am, it is now 2:30 in the morning. You can't be here. I am sleepy and I am just doing my job. Can you please come to the front desk with me?" No response or movement. "Listen, I don't feel like doing any paperwork for this. You won't be in trouble. Just come with me and I will let you use my phone to call your boyfriend and he can come get you. I need you to come with me for your safety too. If you don't come with me, I have to call the police department to have them escort you out of the building, and then I have to do a lot of paperwork." Just before I dial the last digit to my supervisor, the girl looks at me. By looks at me, I mean she rotated her head towards me. She was staring down the whole time, but rotated her head so she was no longer looking at the ground on her left, but directly at me on her right. While staring at me, she said, "Do you know what happened 3 days ago?" Then rotated her head back away from me and towards the wall like I found her. At this point, I am thinking that this is a weird scenario and question, but at least she is talking to me now. Maybe I won't have to wake anyone else up and call the cops for something dumb. So I respond, "No, what happened 3 days ago?" She rotates her head towards me, otherwise perfectly still, and laughs a loud, boisterous, yet feminine laugh. She then rotated her head away again. Then rotated back to me and said, "You really don't know?" Politely, "Nope." "Jesus Christ was reborn 3 days ago," she says with a wild, toothy smile on her otherwise lovely face. Then she moves her body for the first time and pointed at a door at the end of the hall and said, "Jesus Christ was reborn 3 days ago and he is in that room." Then she returns to her frozen position staring at the floor. Remember, at this point I'm sleep-deprived and brain-dead, and on some level I realize that this is really freaky and potentially dangerous, but mostly I just want this situation to end, so I play along. I asked her, "Does Jesus have a cell phone? Because you can call him from mine downstairs and I'm sure he will come escort you." Of course he has a cell phone, but he is not answering my calls. Okay, now I'm done. I pick up my phone to call my supervisor to let him know what's going on, and just then she turns to me again. "Can you help me with something?" Again, trying to be a nice guy and not wake others up, I take it as a good sign that she is still talking to me. I decide to continue to play along so that hopefully we can resolve this quickly and quietly. I say, "I would love to help you. How about you help me, then I help you?" She nodded and froze up for another moment before asking something under her breath. Then she asked again, this time louder. "I need you to take care of the booby trap for me." "What?" Then she points to something I hadn't previously noticed. Directly blocking her path to the door where Jesus Christ himself supposedly resided was a rope. The rope was tied to doorknobs on either side of the hallway, a classic freshman prank which prevents the occupants of either room from opening their doors. Apparently this practical joke looked, to her, like a tripwire, one which she was very concerned about and had undoubtedly led her to her trance-like state. I told her that I would take care of the booby trap, a fire hazard anyway, if people can't get out of their rooms, if she came downstairs with me. She remained stock still until finally she turned towards me, yelled something unintelligible, and charged the booby trap, still yelling. She actually leaped over it and charged towards Jesus's room. Now I finally panic. I follow her in hot pursuit, resting assured that Jesus surely had the sense not to open the door to this, now screaming, "Lady." I pulled out my phone and called my supervisor, Alan, who, in a haze of sleepiness and skepticism about my 30-second summary of the situation, told me to not call the police and wait for him. "Sure, Alan." At this point she was banging on Jesus's door, and I was just praying he wouldn't be dumb enough to open it. Surely he wouldn't be dumb enough to open it. Finally, this screaming lady decides to take a break from banging on the door with both hands and tries the doorknob, turning the handle. Click, the door is unlocked. I'm right behind her, frozen in panic as she enters the room. Fortunately, all of the bedroom doors in the dorm were locked, but she was quite literally in their general room now, banging on the interior doors and yelling just as loudly. I am still frozen watching this happen. Eventually she gives up, turns and sees me and screams at me before running out of the apartment, by me, and down the stairwell. I turn and follow, and then my night gets even more surreal. Strewn all the way down the 10 flights of stairs are broken pieces of a futon, wet floor warning signs, random debris, and inexplicable spatters of white paint. Literally more broken junk on every flight. Following her all the way down and out of the building and into the courtyard below, where she runs 50 yards from the building and turns to watch me as I return to the lobby to meet up with Gary and Alan and fill them in. As soon as I finish explaining, I turn to see 2 young men walk into our lobby, one of whom is on crutches. Ducking behind them is, you guessed it, the lady from the 10th floor. I whisper, "Alan, that's her behind them." Alan now takes control of the situation. I am relieved to just be back up now. Alan stops the 3 of them. "Guys, is she with you?" Both of whom shake their head furiously, and it is quite obvious that they are trying to get away from her, but are slowed significantly by the crutches. Alan lets the boys slip past him and into an elevator, but tries to stop the lady by putting his arms out and trying to corral her without touching her. Touching is generally a no-no in these situations, and calmly saying something along the lines of, "I'm gonna need you to stop here for a minute." Instead, she grabs his arm, lifts it up and walks under it and joins the 2 gentlemen on the elevator, both of whom are freaking out and huddled into one corner while she stands in her all-too-familiar position in the opposite corner. Alan also stepped onto the elevator and held the doors open. The guys got off and decided to take the stairs despite the crutches, while Alan spoke calmly with the lady from the 10th floor, who showed no signs of budging. Eventually the elevator door alarms were going off, and Alan hopped all the way onto the elevator as it headed back to the 10th floor. I again panicked as they were stuck in a confined space together, and I booked it up in hot pursuit. By the time that I arrived, the lady was running from one end of the hall to the other, screaming and banging on random doors. The aforementioned booby trap had been taken care of by Alan. Alan was calmly walking behind her while on the phone with police. When she changed direction and ran past him, he slowly turned and followed her the other way. I began to follow Alan in the same fashion until the lady ran back to the elevators, pushed the down button, and stopped, returning to her previous stance. Alan and I also waited. The elevator came and the lady stood in a corner in the same fashion, and Alan and I occupied two of the other corners and quietly waited as we descended back to the ground floor. The lady looked at Alan, made her hand into the shape of a gun and shot it at Alan, then said, "Fuck you." She then looked at me, shot me with her finger pistol, and repeated the phrase. When we got to the ground floor, she stepped off the elevator. We followed, she froze, we stayed. Eventually she just started laughing again and looked straight into Alan's eyes and asked her, "What's your favorite animal?" She then returned to her, now classic, frozen stance with her head down. Alan and I exchanged a confused look and remained silent. She repeated her question. After a moment, Alan sheepishly replied, "A hyena, I guess." She began laughing again, and then her body suddenly unfroze and she slowly walked toward Alan. "You wouldn't want to make me angry. You will not enjoy it. When I get angry, I'm gonna come at you like a hyena," and she returns to her laughter, which sounds progressively unhinged. Now, I am fully aware of how hilarious this sounds, but when I was there in the moment, it was more freaky, scary than funny. She eventually freaked out, shouted some more explicatives, and turned on her heel towards the door and straight into the two police officers on the other side. The officers tried to stop her to question her and immediately began to fight against them. She literally just went wild and the officers had to team up to put her in handcuffs. I just stood slack-jawed and watched as they wrestled her into the car, waited for backup, and then came back to take our statements. We eventually found out that she was also a student at the university who had been stalking the resident who lived in that room. She had come off of her medicine and had a breakdown, which resulted in the story. I was the control room supervisor at the nuclear plant I work at. 1 a.m. on a Saturday, nothing is going on. We are bored out of our mind. Out of nowhere, over 200 alarms come in all at once along with the room lights flickering. I immediately turn and look. Usually flickering lights means we either had a large pump malfunction or a reactor shutdown. But we usually don't get 200 alarms at the same time. The next 10 seconds felt like 5 minutes as I'm trying to assess the status of the unit. As I turn my head from left to right, I see all my equipment is still functioning despite all sorts of system failure and trip alarms. When my head turns all the way right, I'm looking at the reactor and see it is still critical, despite reactor trip alarms being in. My blood pressure immediately shoots up and I see the rest of the crew notice the same thing. Why the hell was the core still online? Everyone was just staring at the full core display and the red control rod out lights that were still lit. Reactor scram failures are a huge deal. They are extraordinarily rare. Only one has occurred in the U.S. commercial nuclear industry. We train for them around 40% of the time because they require rapid actions to make the reactor safe. So when you are sitting here questioning why the reactor is still online, it really drives up the anxiety. Is this really happening? And if it is real, you have around 2 minutes to commence taking actions to reduce core subcooling to prevent core damage. The reactor control operator starts reaching for the reactor scram switch and turns his head to look at me and says my name. I can see it in his eyes. His heart has to be pounding hard too. Him and I have worked together long enough that I already know what he's thinking. He wants to make sure at least one other person agrees with him before he punches out the reactor, so that if he's wrong, it's not a unilateral decision. He also is really hoping someone will tell him he's crazy and he needs to sit back down. I finally took a long deep breath, my first since the alarms came in. That breath re-energized my brain and got everything thinking correctly. I took a few extra seconds to scan the panels just to be absolutely sure. I was concerned we had to scram the core. We had reactor trip indications which should have shut the reactor down, but it was still online. But between that deep breath and those few extra seconds, I saw it as clear as day. On one of my control boards, one of our power lines went down. I look up at the generator information screen and see that grid voltage just spiked off scale, high then low, and stabilized. I look back down and see some power grid circuit breakers tripped. The rest of the plant was stable, water levels stable, power level stable, coolant flow and pressure stable. Right at that time, the secondary reactor operator starts pointing at the power grid panel too. Everything made sense now. I raise my hand and say, "Update, power line X2 has dropped. We've had an electrical system perturbation. The unit remains online and stable. Everyone walk down your boards to verify system status and report back when you are complete." Reactor trip criteria was not met. Entering loss of power off normal. End of update. The reactor controls operator turns his head and sees the same thing I did. A power line went down. He nods his head, leans away from the mode switch, takes his own deep breath, presses the alarm silence button, and sits down. Just as fast as it started, I see everyone's anxiety level rapidly drop and we start clearing the alarms. I call up the power grid and they already had someone on their way to us. Apparently, a vehicle struck a telephone pole and caused almost a mile of power line to go down pretty close to the plant. The field it was in was on fire as a result. It was pretty impressive. We've had issues in the past where a power grid perturbation from a lightning strike causes a few spurious alarms. But we've never had that many come in at once. Because the perturbation was that close to the plant, it caused a deeper perturbation and most of our alarm system basically rebooted. It's a solid-state system, so it can do that, causing all the false alarms. More than anything, I felt our training and teamwork kick in. Using diverse indications to validate the condition, getting backup from the team, and taking a few seconds to stay level-headed. Our fundamentals kicked in and we made the right decision. Even though for about 15 seconds I almost needed a change of pants. I used to be one of the nighttime duty managers at a hotel. The hotel consists of the main house, which was built in the late 90s, early 2000s, and the old house, which was built in the 14th century. There are a few spooky stories about the old house and the grounds, which all come from actual events. At one point, it was listed as the third most haunted building in Britain. I wouldn't say that I was a believer or a denier of ghost stories. I thought some events can be explained and some can't. Being a local, I was familiar with all the stories, and my dad had worked there for years when I started. Like I say, wasn't a believer and wasn't a denier. That was until I became a duty manager. Being a duty manager is a simple enough role, dealing with complaints from hotel guests, handing over to the next duty manager, etc. One of my duties as a nighttime duty manager was to lock up areas of both parts of the hotel. Places like the bar, restaurant, and gift shop. Other things such as making sure fire doors are closed, that emergency lighting is working, and closing and locking windows for security. This part of the job was extensive: every window, fire door, and emergency lighting. I had to check this every single night. Now, the old house is where all the spooky stuff happens. In the old house is a chapel, pretty standard for a house of that size and age in Britain. This is where I experienced the first spooky thing. There is one window in the chapel that no matter how many times you close and lock that window, the next time you walk past, it'll be open again. This was experienced by myself, the other duty managers, and even the security guards. Nothing horrifying, but it gets worse. The next spot is a set of stairs called the Jerusalem staircase, named so as the wood for the stairs comes from Jerusalem. Some stories about a ghost dog on these stairs that trip people up. I don't think anything of this. It's stairs, people trip on stairs all the time. However, they lead to a room called the Long Gallery. Now this is a very long room, close to 100 meters. Other than the length, there's nothing else to the room. I was doing my rounds one night, had come in to do my checks as normal, when suddenly I can hear heavy footsteps coming from the other side of the room, which is possible there are guest rooms at the other end. I shine my torch down the room and can see nothing. Then it gets scary. The footsteps slowly become harder and faster until they sound like someone sprinting towards me. I am frozen. Next thing I know, whack, I've been shoved against the wall with pain in my back, stomach, and chest like I've been tackled. There is a similar room directly above, but that is only accessible to duty managers and security. Again, not the only person to experience this. The last coup relate to a confirmed murder in the house. It's a long story, so I'll give the TLDR. Lord of the house and his wife are expecting a baby. Lord has heard a rumor that wife had an affair. Had a local nurse abducted and brought to the house to deliver the baby. Baby then snatched by the Lord and thrown into the fireplace and murdered his wife. Nurse escapes and curses the family, saying no male heir will be born to the family. The curse kind of came true. No male heir has survived long after birth. Now the bedroom where these events took place is popular part of the old house with guests visiting all the time. However, it's not the real room. That's directly above. I have been in the room more times than I can count. Reports of a crying baby are common but never proved. One thing never reported was blood dripping from the ceiling. As mentioned, the real bedroom is directly above, so myself and security investigated. We found nothing, nobody, not even a drop of blood. The second part is about a sculpture in the chapel of one of the male heirs that died shortly after birth as a result of the curse. The sculpture is pretty normal looking, baby in cloth with its eyes closed. Apart from one night the eyes were open. I ran so fast out of that chapel, I'm pretty sure I broke the land speed record. So there's my experiences. The hotel, if you are interested, is called Little Coat House Hotel.